Hello, students of English 215. This is Professor Koch, and in this video, I want to give you some really important context for the literature we're reading these next few weeks. We're going to be focusing on the slave narratives by Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, and also the novel The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, even though it's fictionalized, uses some of these conventions as well, one might argue. So this will give you some important context for these next few weeks. So when we talk about slave narratives, also known as fugitive slave narratives, we're talking about a particular subset of slave narratives. Many slave narratives were recorded from the 1700s onward, and often a white anthropologist or historian or journalist would record what a former enslaved person had to tell them. The slave narratives that we're studying are actually written themselves by the formerly enslaved person. And these, as William Andrews, the scholar, points out, took their classic form and tone in 1840 to 1865, so the decades right before the Civil War. They were very popular in this period. Our textbook says that from 1830 to the end of the slavery era, the fugitive slave narrative dominated the literary landscape of antebellum Black America. Antebellum meaning pre-war. And many of them were sponsored by the American Anti-Slavery Society, an organization led by William Lloyd Garrison. He is the author of the preface to Douglass's slave narrative, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about the purposes of these slave narratives. First of all, to arouse the sympathy of readers and to motivate them to act. And let's clarify that the readers of these slave narratives were largely white Northerners who wanted to know more about slavery. So people who were writing these narratives knew that they were writing for, generally speaking, for a white audience. And these writers wanted to expose the cruelty of slavery. Pro-slavery propaganda was a pretty powerful force. We'll look at an image or two in a minute here. So slave narrative authors wanted to expose what was really happening in slavery to people who might not have ever seen it firsthand before. They also wanted to emphasize Christian ideals. In the last video, I spoke with you about how literature of this period often showed how the African American writer also valued the same Christian ideals that much of their audience would have valued. In the same way, they showed acceptance of mainstream American ideals such as liberty, independence, and justice. This image is difficult to look at, but I want you to see the kind of pro-slavery, offensive stereotypes that were popular. The idea of the happy slave, the well-treated slave, the slave that had lots of leisure time was a pretty powerful one at the time, but the reality, of course, was that enslaved people very frequently suffered enormously under slavery. We looked at this sketch in the previous video, so you can see there again the effort to create slavery as a very peaceful and happy institution that allowed Black families to thrive. Now, it's possible that there were situations like this, but they were not the majority. So slave narratives are going to tell the reality. The next image is graphic, so if you want to close your eyes for the next 10 seconds or so, this is a photograph that was published in 1863 of a former enslaved man. You can see the scars from frequent whippings on his back. This man's name was Gordon, and this became a very popular image that tried to correct the record about what slavery was really like. So when we get to these slave narratives that are published, we begin to see a pattern emerge, and I would like you to really have a grasp of these four stages of the plot pattern. The first stage is loss of innocence or awareness of slave status. What I mean by that is this is where the writer describes coming into the knowledge that he or she is enslaved. In this part of the slave narrative, and this is a very large part of the slave narrative, the writer describes continued dehumanization, being treated like an animal. there are depictions of, as our book says, slavery's physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual deprivation. So let's note here that it's not just that these enslaved people were physically abused. They were deprived in these other ways as well. Pay attention to that and how Jacobs and Douglas describe these other kinds of deprivations in addition to the physical. And then we see these writers describing increasing self-reliance, the ability to do more independently outside of the institution of slavery. Often this involves literacy, the quest for literacy, the attainment of the ability to read and write. And then this stage typically ends with some sort of spiritual crisis, of bottoming out, at absolute despair at the condition of being enslaved, which leads to the next stage, and that is the resolution to be free. This is where the narrator decides, I'm going to run away. I'm going to get away from this. I can't live like this forever. In this stage, we see that the narrator typically maintains their faith in God, and that's a big part of what gets them through this, and also a determination and commitment to attaining liberty. The third stage is the escape. This is often portrayed as a struggle to overcome evil in a quest for freedom. Watch for depictions of evil and hell when it comes to slavery. So we see this struggle to attain freedom. You'll note that often the narrator does not describe the escape in detail. Pay attention to how Douglas describes why he doesn't want to tell us how he escaped. And then finally, at the end of the slave narrative, there's redemption, the attainment of freedom. Often at this stage, the enslaved person decides to rename himself, so that he doesn't have to live, or she, with the name of the enslaver. And there's also a commitment to activism, to the abolitionist movement, and also more generally to citizenship. Okay, so let's talk about some recurring motifs or ideas, images, and themes that we see in these slave narratives. And again, think about these when you are reading Douglas and Jacobs, and also eventually the novel by Colson Whitehead. Okay, the hardest part probably for most readers is reading about these abuses of slavery. Often these are abuses that our history books in middle school and high school tend to gloss over. So you'll see some difficult depictions of physical assault, sexual assault, starvation, extreme cold, not enough clothing, often of women and children. Another theme is the destruction of the family members being sold away at auctions, family members being separated because of the belief that enslaved people were not fully human and therefore couldn't feel grief or loss the way that white people did. They were considered property. We also see, as we've touched on before, the piety or the faith of enslaved people. Often they show a deeper understanding of Christianity and scripture than the enslavers do. With that in mind, the hypocrisy of the enslavers and their moral and spiritual corruption. We've touched on already the quest for literacy and the power of it once it's attained. When you read the excerpts of Douglas, pay attention to what he's able to do once he gains the ability to read and write and how he uses that power. And as I mentioned already, the quest for freedom. Finally, there are overt, direct appeals to the audience to feel sympathetic and act accordingly. Remember, they're writing for a white audience, a mainly middle-class audience who might already be sympathetic. That's why they're reading the slave narratives. But the narrators of these narratives want this white audience to do something, not just to feel sympathetic, but also to act to end slavery. In the previous video, I talked a little bit about authenticating documents, and watch for those in these slave narratives as well. As our book editors say, these documents attested to the reliability and good character of the narrator. Remember the racism of the time. led many white people to believe that Black people were simply incapable of writing, of reasoning. This is some very heavy-duty white supremacy that really informs the thinking of the time. So often you'd see white people going out of their way to ensure the white audience that, yes, this person really did do this reading or this writing. Okay, so here is an excerpt from the preface that I asked you to read for Douglas's slave narrative, written by William Lloyd Garrison. I mentioned him earlier. He was one of the abolitionist movement leaders, a white man. It is therefore entirely his own production, Garrison assures his audience. It is, in my judgment, highly creditable to his head and heart. I am confident that it is essentially true in all its statements. The influences. There are several influences for these slave narratives. We've already mentioned religious themes in these narratives. The King James Bible, biblical allusion and imagery. Pay particular attention to that in chapter 10 when you get there in Frederick Douglass. Pay attention again to how the slave narratives authors use images of hell and Satan to describe slavery and enslavers. Often the rhetoric is abolitionist in its tone, so the kind of anti-slavery rhetoric used in these slave narratives is similar to what was used in the wider abolitionist movement. And then in terms of literary references, if you took English 211 here at Prairie State, you might have studied a captivity narrative by Mary Rowlandson. This is a genre in which white Puritans, colonists describe being kidnapped by Native Americans in times of war, and how they felt that they were being punished and how they prayed for deliverance. The spiritual autobiography, a genre in which somebody describes their conversion to Christianity. And then finally, American Romanticism, which was these narratives are appearing in the Romantic period. You see a lot of emphasis on individualism, the power of the individual, the innate goodness and improvability of the individual. So look for those themes as well. Here are the sources used in this little video, but also more recommended reading for you as well. Okay, you can see this last one is from our book. So there you are. If you have any questions about slave narratives or anything in this video, make sure to ask in the discussions. And take another look again if you want to take more careful notes on this video for the next little quiz that we're having. I hope that you really enjoy reading the works of Douglass and Jacobs. They're extremely powerful and I think necessary reading for all of us. All right, thanks for your attention, and I will see you in our discussions.